Hi, and welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Silver Donald Cameron. He's come down from Cape Breton. He has a new book called The Living Beach. He's a lover of seas, of sand, of windswept coasts. Welcome, Don.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Good to have you here. You begin the book with the reference to the Gaia principle, the Gaia hypothesis, that the planet is one large single organism. Do you really believe that?
Well, reputable scientists do, not all of them. Not too much, I guess, is agreed by all reputable scientists. But no, the argument was put forward by James Lovelock that the Earth is a self-regulating gigantic organism, and you know, when certain and his basic, I guess, evidence for that is the stability in the atmosphere of unstable gases, gases that want to disappear. So they're obviously being produced at a constant rate and consumed at a constant rate, and they're always there at the same proportions in the atmosphere. There's only one thing that can produce that, and that's life. And so that led him to this hypothesis that the Earth was a single living being, and that each of us is, and each aspect of it is like a cell in a body, or a fingernail, or a piece of hair, or something.
Of course, if we all buy into that, we're obviously going to start to change our attitude toward the Earth and the way that we treat it, right?
One would like to think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. What about the beach itself? Of course, your title there, The Living Beach. You study it as if it is a single living organism, not just a pile of rocks and a bunch of sand and some weeds sticking out the top.
Yeah, and that really comes from a scientist at the Bedford Institute across the harbor here, Bob Taylor, who at one point said to me early on in the game, actually started the whole project, which is now gone into many forms. I mean, the book, the video, the television show, the new radio series, so on. But Bob said, when the beach is under stress, it defends itself by moving sand back from the dunes and out into the water and creating a bar that forces the waves to break further out. And then when the stress is over and the storm is gone, it nudges the sand back up and rebuilds the wide sandy beach that we know and stores the sand back in the dunes. And I said, you know, you talk as though the damn thing were alive. And he said, I think of it that way. And so I began to think about, because I think a lot of us have had the same experience I have. You go to a beach over and over again, it's different all the time. Sometimes
Sure.
It's shallow, sometimes it's narrow, sometimes it's rocky, sometimes it's sandy, sometimes it cuts a little deeper into the land or sticks a little further out into the water. And I began to think, well, yeah, it is. It moves around like a living creature. It can be nourished, it can be starved, it defends itself, it is vulnerable to attack, and so on. What if it were alive? And in any case, how does it work, whether it's alive or not? What's the process here? And of course, then you start to say, well, I'm a process. Right? The tree is a process. The beach is a process. How come we say these are living and those are not? And that leads you into some questions of language and concepts about the relationship to the natural world that we started with.
And the sand is an amazing commodity. I watch it at Lawrencetown Beach where I live, and it disappears, of course, in the winter. Well, it doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And then it seems to come back, as if it's, you know, migrating.
Exactly the mechanism that Bob's talking about. I mean, in the winter you get the storms coming in, and they rip the sand out and push it out, and then but that forces the storms to do their mischief further offshore
And it's
not
a kind
to
of
attack the
defense.
beach. Yeah, it works as a defense. And then when the stormy season is gone and you get those, instead of getting those carving breakers of storm waves, you get those sort of tumbling breakers. Well, they nudge sand back in again. By the time you get around to July, lo and behold, here's the beach again. People get quite alarmed when they go to their favorite beaches
Sure.
in the middle of the winter
It's
and
all
suddenly
gone.
say, it's all gone.
Yeah.
Right? And by next summer, it's all back.
Wow. Give me a portrait of a beach that you're most intimate with.
Well, I guess interestingly enough, I just had to write something on favorite beaches, and traveling with my buddy Charlie Doucette and making the film thing, we saw a lot of beaches all down the East Coast. But when I think of a beach, I guess people think of three beaches. One of them is the beach on which you were a child, which in my case is a beach on the West Coast. We had a family summer cottage, went to for many years. Second one you think of is a beach that's sort of patriotic, it's close to home, it's a part of the territory that you particularly love, and for me that's Pondville Beach in Isle Madame on Cape Breton. 3 or 4 miles from my home, a beach where we walk the dog. And the third one is a sort of an ideal beach, which is generally a beach with nobody on it except you and perhaps someone you love or some particularly favorite person. But there's a notion of being kind of lost in in solitude in this great big active environment. And I think all of us have a kind of a model beach like that as a place where we sometime hope to be, and occasionally do actually get to.
And they are metaphysical places. They're spiritual places, aren't they? Or
Absolutely.
we make them so by our presence there. Because this thing happens when you stare off at the sea or up into the sky.
There is certainly, it certainly enforces your sense of insignificance, and I think that's always a kind of a healthy thing. But they're also a very plastic environment, and there aren't very many of those. I mean, there aren't many places where you can go and actually see geological change occurring moment by moment before your very eyes, or where you can actually see the interrelationship of life forms and of geological forms and so on. But you can see all out at the beach. I mean, things are always moving. Even on a calm day, you go and look at the very edge of the surf, and there's the sand moving around in the waves, and there's stuff drifting
Sure.
by in the.
And then I,
So, well, if you think of life as a process, which is ultimately what I came to think of, you can really see a large process there and be in it and part of it. And there aren't many places in the world where you can do that.
yeah, I was thinking of the, looking down at those little ripples in the sand, and then looking at photographs of the Sahara Desert and something, and saying, same thing, same patterns.
Same sort of phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah. Is every beach an individual? Do they have unique qualities to them?
Yes, and that's one of the most astonishing things I think that I ran into. All down the U.S. East Coast, from New York south, is this long chain of barrier islands, which are really beach islands. And you can go to one after another, and they're all different, and yet you can't, it's hard to see why they would be different. I mean, one may be low and practically no dunes and looks like it's frequently overwashed and so on and so forth. The next one could, may have high dunes and a maritime forest down and a little stunted forest down in among the dunes and so on. There doesn't seem to be any obvious reason why those two islands should be different. They're side by side. They have the same orientation to the prevailing wind and all the rest of it. But for whatever reason, they've developed personalities of their own. And I think almost every beach does have that quality. There are big things in common, as there are between, say, individual human beings. But like us, they're all different.
Now you're talking about those barrier islands, and I keep thinking that we're not a very bright species. We build houses upon these places that we know will change. They'll be assaulted by hurricanes, or inlets will form where solid land once was. But we continue to build and rebuild after the storms on this piece of real estate that ain't going to be there all the time.
And you see that just everywhere. I mean, I was on the beaches in Scarborough, Ontario recently, on the Great Lakes, and they're up along the Scarborough bluffs, and the bluffs are what create the beaches. As the bluffs erode, that's what provides sand to the beach. They're sitting up on top of the sand that's going to be down on the beach, are houses that are, of course, going to be down on the beach sometime soon, and they go regularly, People keep on building them. There are places in California where there are 4 or 5 streets, whole streets have disappeared over the years. And as each street disappears, the real estate value first goes up for the succeeding street, because it's now the bluff side one with a big view.
Beachfront property.
And then a little while later, the value goes down as it starts to become endangered. Yeah, crazy.
Now, erosion, we think of that in human terms, it's a bad thing, right? The waves, the storms, the rain, everything. It erodes, and isn't that a terrible thing? But it's not really that way in the big picture at all, is it?
Well, no. Really, erosion is simply one of the processes by which the Earth changes itself, and by a particular feature like a beach will react to to change. At the moment, the big change is rising sea level, which has been going on for several hundreds of years at about a foot a century. And so that looks to us like the land is being lost. Well, in fact, it's being lost during this relatively brief period in the Earth's history, and sea level will go back down again at some point in the future, and then the sea will appear to be in retreat. It won't matter to us. We won't be around to see that. Yeah. But the curious thing to me is the hubris of thinking we can stop that. I mean, you go.
And that's where the worst mistakes are made, isn't it?
Yeah, you go to a place like Miami, and there's a great long wall of hotels, and there are seawalls and artificial dunes. Of course, the sand has been taken away. The beach has disappeared. The water has intruded almost into the hotels in some cases. So now we've replaced all the sand, but now what we have is a completely artificial beach. I mean, it's as I remarked somewhere in the book, that walking on such a beach is about as stimulating as walking a stuffed dog.
So it's in some of those cases, you're pumping the sand from offshore back onshore in hopes that it's somehow going to stay there and then protect the rest of your real estate that's behind it. But you can't really mess around with those forces of nature that much. They want to go back and do what they're doing anyway, don't they?
That's right, and in the end they will. I mean, I came to realize I was thinking differently about conservation as I got further and further into the whole beach research, because you see these signs that say, stay on the boardwalk and don't walk on the dunes and the fragile dunes and the delicate dune grasses. Nonsense. I mean, the beach is as tough as can be, far tougher than we are. The beach grasses are tougher than we are. I mean, you can bury them under 6 feet of sand and they'll work their way back up through the sand. So what are we really seeing here? The beach is going to be there. The beach doesn't, in the end of the day, the beach is going to win. So what we're really saying is we want to preserve the present position of the beach because for whatever reason, we like it there. That's really what we're doing, and this business that we're in some sense protecting the beaches. I mean, the only thing we can do to damage a beach is this kind of thing that I've just alluded to in Miami, and that doesn't even so much damage the beach over the long term. And I mean, the long term is like 10,000 years, not 20 years, but it won't really damage the beach over the long term. The beach will simply overtake us, and I like to imagine at some point in the future an archaeologist going through some sedimentary rock and finding a surfboard, which would
could have been
perhaps
my
be yours.
surfboard, yeah. There. Well, okay, which leads into the next question. I wanted you to talk about waves. You know, you've spoken a bit about that relationship between waves and the beach, but I know you did some research in this book and came up with some interesting stuff. Tell me the story of a wave.
Well, which one?
Pick one, anyone.
They're remarkably different, as you can see by looking looking out at the sea more or less on any day. But they're generated by wind. They're generated by the friction of the air moving on the surface of the water, and the strength of the size of the wave is really a function of how strong the wind is, how long it blows, and over what distance, which is called the fetch. The theoretical maximum wave is, I think, around 250 feet or something of that kind. Nobody has ever seen one, but then if you had been there to see one, would you be there when it had passed? Probably not, you know. I was just reading about the Vendée Globe race in the Southern Ocean, and where you've got guys in 60-foot boats single-handing down,
waves.
Yeah, 6-story waves. I mean, these are enormous waves.
I don't want to surf those waves.
No, and they can travel, you know, enormous distances. I mean, say a tsunami, a tidal wave generated in Alaska, can destroy buildings in Hawaii and Japan and have great effects in Chile. And all that's moving is the waveform. The actual water isn't moving until it actually breaks.
But then when it gets to the beach.
But when it gets to the beach, it starts to drag on the bottom, and then the water starts to move on the top, and you get the crashing, the crashing top or the spilling top, as the case may be. But the only place where water really moves very much in a wave is when the wave stops.
Say that again?
The only place when water really moves very much in a wave is when the wave stops. And what actually happens to the water particle before the wave breaks is it makes a little orbital pattern like that. So it doesn't go forward very much. It's the wave motion that goes forward. Mm-hmm. Only when it starts to break does actual substantial mass of water start to move. Yeah.
Got it. Before we take a break here, a little child's question. Where does sand come from?
Sand comes from everywhere. Sand is the continent shedding its skin slowly.
Ooh, yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like dust in your house is largely small particles of human skin.
Didn't know that either.
Yeah, but the sand comes from all over the continent. Some of it has come from other continental sources in the past. I mean, there's been sand out on the continental shelf that's brought back in again and so on. But it all came originally from the erosion of the land. And
the waves are grinding down those rocks into little tiny
Yes, although that's a less significant fact than you'd think. I mean, on the west coast, you can really see the relationship between erosion, inland erosion, and the building of beaches, because at the mouth of each river there are great beaches, and all sweeping northward up the coast because the currents are mostly coming from the south. So you get these long beaches across river mouths with a little hook at the end where the water actually comes out. But it's the Columbia River that's put that water there, or that sand there. It's the Fraser River, it's the Sacramento River.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, my guest today is Silver Donald Cameron. We're here on the beach today. We're talking about living beaches, and I'll take a short break and be back right after this. Welcome back to Off the Page. My guest is Silver Donald Cameron, and we're talking about living beaches, the life that's upon the beach. What are your favorite creatures that are out there burrowing and wandering around these beaches?
20 years ago, I would have said girls,
yeah.
Which is probably what a lot of us go to the beaches for. I guess the one that fascinated me the most, I haven't actually seen it live, I've only seen it on tape, are the newborn turtles, particularly in the southeastern beaches in North America, Florida, Georgia, down that way.
And the eggs are buried in the sand, aren't they?
Yeah, the female turtle comes ashore and basically digs a nest, lays the eggs, covers the nest, and leaves. And the warmth of the sun warming the sand actually incubates the eggs, and eventually the turtle has a little kind of beak on the tip of its nose when it's first born, pecks its way through these eggs, and then the turtles climb up out of the sand, just sort of emerge from the sand, and then wiggle down in huge numbers to the water, and off they go to their sea turtle lives. You know, I've seen that in videotape, and I would love to see it. I would love to see it in real life. But it almost looks like the beach is all crawling down to the water.
Yeah, that'd be a good one. Yeah, I think of all the crabs too on beaches, especially the hermit crabs, or some of these really giant kind of crabs that are on shorelines. Very surreal, very ancient kind of things from the dinosaur age or something.
Yeah. We used to see big ones on the West Coast when I was growing up. You know, they'd be the size of a dinner plate, and they'd be, you know, you'd be, say, boating in 6 feet of water and look over the side onto the sand, and it'd be one of these great monsters kind of crabbing along sideways. I mean, the other one that for me is always a great favorite, though, is the birds. There are so many birds along a beach, and so many different kinds of birds, and they change with the seasons and so on. That's another endless source of fascination.
It is. What about the relationship of North American Aboriginal people to beaches? Obviously, they saw them very, very different than we do today, especially before Europeans came over here.
Well, but I think so did Europeans, and in earlier periods too. I mean, our notion of the beach as a place of pleasure and a place you'd really like to be is really only about 150 to 200 years old. It really came along with the Industrial Revolution. But prior to that, for the Aboriginals, and I think for the early Europeans, and in fact for most people through most of history, the beach has been a desert. I mean, it was a place where, you know, awful things happened. I mean, great waves came and washed things away. It was a place of commerce. You know, you went down there to catch seals, trade with other people. It was a place where invaders came, or explorers and so on. But nobody ever actually hung around there. And the habit of the Mi'kmaq, and I think it was the same with many Aboriginal nations, was to spend their time around the shoreline in the summertime when it's relatively pleasant to be there, and there's lots to eat. There's lots of easy food to be gathered, and, you know, pleasant things to do in the summertime. But when the winter came, the Mi'kmaq weren't down on the beach. They were back in the valleys, you know, hidden from the wind, down in the trees, you know, keeping themselves warm and out of the bad weather. So the whole obsession with the beach as a place where you'd want to be on a year-round basis, or as a place where you'd want to be on any permanent basis, is really quite new.
Now, aside from the natural kinds of changes that beaches are going to go through year after year or decade after decade, what other factors come into play from people? What other disasters can befall a beach?
Well, really, really, almost everything that goes wrong on a beach that the agency of humans comes from wanting to keep it there. Comes from wanting to stabilize an unstable situation. I mean, that's one of our oddest habits as a species. Is that, you know, the world is a constant flux. Things are perpetually changing. We really know that in our hearts, but we want things to stand still. We're quite resistant to change. Well, when you bring this to the beach, you're bringing a fairly feeble force for stability, which is us, into an environment where there are absolutely powerful forces for change, and the result of that can be quite catastrophic. And again, in the long term, not for the beach. In the long term, the beaches were there before there were human beings, and they'll be there after there are human beings. It isn't going to matter to the beach, but it will matter a great deal to us.
Yeah, I use that term, the New Jerseyization or something of beaches. This is putting up those seawalls to try and hold the ocean outside. That's
right, and it's a futile task. And in fact, we were at one place in New Jersey where I stood up on a seawall that was as wide as a 2-story highway, 30 feet high. I mean, just a huge dam-like structure that went for miles down the coast, and when you climbed up on the top of it, I mean, you couldn't see the water from the first or second story of a house across the road. But when you finally climbed on top of the seawall, what you saw were ruins stretching out in parallel bands out to sea of previous seawalls. I mean, jagged pieces of steel, old pilings, you know, piles of rubble and rock and so forth. Just this awful junk heap in the surf zone, stretching out until the water got too deep to conceal it.
And even at that, it's kind of hopeless, isn't it?
Well, you know, there in front of you are 7 or 8 layers of failure, and you're just standing on the next one, that's all.
If we're talking about the beach as a living thing, does a beach have rights? And who owns the beach?
Well, who owns the beach varies from place to place. In most sort of common law jurisdictions, it's been held to be the Crown or its successor, the people, or something of that kind. Some places it's owned to the low tide line. Some states in the United States it's owned to the low tide line, and that confers certain rights on the owner. But the question I came to raise, actually it was raised by a geologist named Stanley Riggs in North Carolina. Riggs said, shouldn't the beach itself have some rights?
Mm-hmm.
And he refers back to an essay by a law professor named Christopher Stone in California, who in turn had argued that natural objects should have rights. And I think it's maybe easier to see with a river than with a beach. A river is a comparable sort of fluid, plastic, moving form. If you're upstream from me and you dump garbage in the river and we go to court about it, what the court will generally do is order you to stop and give me some money. But there may be irreparable damage that's been done to the river, and the river was not a party to the dispute. I mean, the fact that the river may remain, the court may even say to you, you've got to give them so much every year and you can keep on polluting. But doesn't the river have any rights in this? Doesn't the natural world that we all rely on have any rights in this? So the argument that seems to be emerging is that we should be conferring some rights on natural objects, so they should have a right to be protected, and that somebody should have a right to go to court, not to say you're ruining my enjoyment of it, but you're ruining the river, and on behalf of the river, we're going to compel you to stop.
Well, that's an interesting new frontier of legal arguments, but it makes good sense because it's good for us, or it's good for people who will be alive in the future, doesn't it?
And there may be even some I hate to say this, but some faint signs of ethical progress here, because I mean actually the whole category of things that have rights has been extended over the years, so it now includes children who didn't used to have rights, women who didn't used to have rights, black people who didn't used to have rights, immigrants who didn't used to have rights. You know, we've extended that whole category of things with rights, and maybe it's time to move it into some new territory.
Sounds like a good idea to me. My guest today is Silver Donald Cameron. We're going to take a very short break and come back and finish up with beaches right after this. We're back at Off the Page. My guest today has been Silver Donald Cameron. We're talking about beaches. Do beaches have souls?
Hard to say. Hard to say. They sometimes almost seem to, and you see how active they are in responding to the environment around them. But you know, ultimately we do, and I guess maybe that's what draws me to beaches in the end. There's a kind of a magic about them. There's a kind of a mystery about them. They're a kind of ceaseless dance between the sea and the land. All kinds of creatures live there, move around, come and go on them, and so including us. And for me, you know, it was really the magic and the mystery of this whole process that I guess drew whatever is in my soul that's interested in where I really am and what the world really is.
We're going to do the right thing and protect those beaches that maybe have souls, that at least have rights.
Well, if we are, we're going to do it in Canada, because there aren't too many places left in the world where there are beaches remaining to be protected. I mean, one of the things that shocked me was to see how much of the shorelines of the developed world are already cribbed up with rocks and sea walls and hotels and so on and so forth. There are very few wild beaches left in the developed world. Canada has a significant number of them. And I think has a particular responsibility. I mean, we have a lot of them here in the Maritimes, and they aren't going to last forever. They're being bought up now. So I think if we're going to do anything about it, we'll do it soon after.
Don, thanks for coming to Halifax and being on the show.
It's been my pleasure.
And I thank you for watching Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. I hope you'll come back and join us again next time.